Hello, everyone. First, I wanted to thank the organizers for the opportunity to present this paper. It's really an honor to be here. So this is a joint work with Mahsa Kaviani, Lily Lee, Mahsa is from University of Delaware, Lily at Temple University, and I'm with the Florida State University. So as we know, the influence of partisan media on the behavior of individuals is a highly debated topic. It gets way more heated around elections, but in general, it's an important question. So that we have research that shows exposure to partisan media can influence individuals' behavior. But in this paper, we're going to be taking a different approach and ask whether this can influence corporate policies. And in a nutshell, we find that it does. So let me begin with some background. The literature shows that media in the US is becoming more and more polarized, and a great deal of increasing ideological polarization in society is attributed to exposure to partisan news. We know from the literature that exposure to media can affect individuals' voting behavior, and specifically, for example, if audience is exposed to Fox News messaging, the vote share of Republicans increases. But surprisingly, there is very limited evidence on whether partisan media can influence corporate policies. And in this paper, we're going to be addressing this question by looking at firms' corporate social responsibility activities, or CSR. So you may ask, why CSR? Well, we have two main reasons for that. First, it's an important policy issue. So let me give you some background on that. 2018, almost 90% of S&P 500 index companies publish corporate social responsibility reports. In US alone, CSR expenditures sum to very large amounts. So 2018 numbers are here. They spent $28 billion on sustainability, $15 billion on corporate philanthropy. So it's a significant expenditure. But even more important is CSR is linked to ideological beliefs. You know, we know that liberals and conservatives differ in key issues related to CSR. For example, on climate change, environmental protection, taxes and welfare, and also labor unions. So to corroborate this idea, I have two pieces of literature here for you. The first one is DiGiulio and Kostovsky 2014. They show that companies with Democrat directors rank higher on CSR. And the second one, Hang and Kostovsky 2012, they show, it's a very interesting one, Democrat investment managers usually hold portfolios with higher CSR rankings. There's also a very important literature that shows CSR expenditures are largely influenced by political motives and ideologies. For example, in their AER 2020 paper, Bertrand, Bombardini, Fissman, and Trevi show that CSR expenditures may be tools for political influence in America. Now, what we do in this paper, to study the corporate CSR, we look at Sinclair Broadcasting Group. So it's an interesting broadcasting company because there's a lot of talk that it's more conservative than Fox News and also much less known to the general public. So what we do is that we exploit this staggered expansion of Sinclair across America, and as an exogenous variation in firms' exposure to conservative messaging, and then measure CSR rankings of firms before and after exposure. So it's basically a difference in different setting. So let me give you some background on Sinclair now. So Sinclair was founded in 1986. And after that, it expands quite rapidly. 1995, it has an IPO, continues to grow very fast over the next decades. And I'm going to jump to 2019. You have some staggering numbers here. It now owns or controls 193 TV stations, or local TV stations. It is present in 90 local TV markets out of 210 local TV markets. So its presence is almost in 50% of those markets. It covers 39% of US population, which makes it the biggest owner-operator of local TV networks in America. And let me show you how Sinclair expands geographically across America. In this graph that you see here, we take snapshots of Sinclair media entry across US every 5 years, starting 1996 all the way to 2016, which is the last day in our sample. As you can observe, the expansion is both across time and space, and also at different magnitudes, that is shown by color codes. So the areas that you see here are not states or counties, they are local TV markets. So local TV market is defined by the distinguished designated market area, DMA. So why DMA is important is because viewers in the same DMA receive same or similar media coverage. And the important thing about DMA is that, like, we have 3,000 counties across America, but 210 DMA. So each DMA will include multiple counties, and sometimes these counties go over multiple states. Another important fact is that DMAs are regulated by the FCC. So Sinclair is not just a regular owner operator of local TV stations. One of the sharpest differences is this. They have segments called must-runs, which kind of orchestrates the same message across multiple, almost all of the TV stations that are owned and operated by Sinclair. So I'm going to show you a very short clip, which became really famous back in 2018, but it's a pretty short one. It shows how these must-runs really work.
The sharing of biased and false news has become all too common on social media. More alarming, some media outlets publish these same fake stories without checking facts first.
The sharing of biased and false news has become all too common on social media. More alarming, some media outlets true without checking facts first. Unfortunately, some members of the media use their platforms to push their own personal bias and agenda to control exactly what people think, and this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
So after watching it like 20 times, it still amazes me how coordinated this video is. So Sinclair is also well known to have a strong conservative lean ever since its founding. So let me give you some anecdotal evidence. First is that Sinclair has reportedly discouraged its anchors from reporting on climate change and guns. It has also reportedly taken strong anti-union instances. President Trump has also praised Sinclair as being far superior to CNN and NBC. But the evidence is not just anecdotal. For example, in the recent American Journal of Political Sciences paper, Martin and McCrane go over Sinclair transcripts. So they do a tremendous job. There's a lot of transcripts that they overview. And so they show that they show two things. First, Sinclair covers more national news, which is more politically charged than local news. And second is that the important part is they estimate the magnitude of the rightward ideology shift in programming in a local market after Sinclair enters. They show that the rightward shift amounts to one standard deviation of the ideology distribution in that market. So it's a pretty big effect. So without getting into too much detail, let me just give you a brief overview of what we find in this paper. First, after 3 years of exposure to Sinclair messaging, the overall CSR scores of firms drop significantly. The drop is not only limited to the overall index, but impacts also each of the components, being environmental, social, and governance. And when we go to cross-sections, we find evidence that's consistent with the effect of ideology. We show that the effect is much stronger for firms that belong to guns, tobacco, and gambling. It is stronger for firms that are located in Republican-leaning counties. And also, it is stronger for firms that are located in DMAs where Sinclair acquires more Fox-affiliated TV stations. We also go beyond that. We show more cross-sectional tests. We find that the effect is stronger for firms with lower institutional ownership. There was a lot of talk about them in Dr. Hart's session. Also younger CEOs and also firms with a history of federal prosecution. So an important question to ask is, how would Sinclair entry to a local TV market affect firms' CSR rankings? So we argue that it can happen for two reasons. First, executives can be subject to influence of media either directly or indirectly. Indirectly meaning by living in a society that has some changes in it, or interacting with friends and family and colleagues and so on. The second is probably it's the coverage and a coverage story, meaning the important thing is that CSR is about media visibility. So Sinclair, because of its conservative bias, may decide to report less on CSR activities of local firms. We also know that it covers more national news than local news. So this may act as a disincentive for firms to engage in CSR. I have to emphasize that these two possible mechanisms are by no means mutually exclusive, and we find consistent evidence with both of them. Now I'm going to briefly go over data. We hand collect Sinclair entry data to different DMAs from Sinclair's 10K filings and FCC database and Capital IQ development data, key developments database. We also use, for CSR ranking, we use KLD database, which is standard in the literature. We also use CompuStat and CRSP, the usual suspects, and US Census Bureau. For our mechanism studies, we use Corporate Prosecution Registry from Duke University website, also county level voting data from Harvard database, Dataverse, and Bordex. So we need to validate Sinclair entry as a quasi-natural experiment for the study of CSR. So what we do here is that we conduct a few studies to ensure that county level characteristics do not predict Sinclair entry. So this is one of the studies that we do. For the sake of time, I can include all of them. So what we do here is that we run a multi-period logit model and also OLS model on a list of county level social and economic and political characteristics, like percentage of Republican votes, college education levels, percentage of female, percentage of Black. None of them load. It is consistent with the idea that expansion of Sinclair is not motivated by some pre-existing characteristics in a DMA that it enters, but it's motivated by economic motives and targeting more populous areas. Let's go over identification strategy now. So our identification follows a difference in differences model. Here is the model. So CSR IT is the corporate social responsibility ranking from KLD database. Alpha I is firm fixed effect, so we're going to be looking at within firm variations. Alpha ST is state by year fixed effect, takes out over time variations in the state's social, political, and economic variations. Sinclair TV is a dummy variable that equals 1 for states after Sinclair entry equals 0 otherwise. Beta, therefore, is our coefficient of interest. If Sinclair entry results in lower CSR levels, we expect a negative sign for beta. Now, here are our main results. As you can see, the effect of Sinclair exposure on corporate CSR is clearly negative and highly statistically significant. So the first column shows you the CSR. I should emphasize that these all include firm fixed effects, so we are looking at within firm variations. And so this one is around 15% of sample standard deviation. The effect also persists when we look at environmental, social, and governance components. The important part and more interesting part is when we look at the magnitude of these effects relative to the standard deviation in the sample. The biggest magnitude goes to environmental, 16.7% relative to sample standard deviation. The next one goes to social component, and the last one goes to the governance. Now we run a battery of robustness checks to make sure that our results are there, they are not influenced by random chance or other variables or other unobservables that are not related to Sinclair entry to DMAs. I'm sorry. So in the first study, we conduct a classic placebo test. So what we do is that we randomize Sinclair entry to DMAs across all DMAs in our sample randomly 1,000 times. We estimate the baseline regression 1,000 times and plot, as you can see, the T statistics. What we can see here is that in most of them, the effect is not significant as we expected. And the red bar here shows the original T statistic from the correct model. It validates that our results are not driven by random chance or some unobservables that are not related to Sinclair entry. Another important result is that we want to make sure that our results are not driven by some few DMAs only. So what we do here is we rerun the original regression model for 1,000 times. Each time we drop 10% of DMAs randomly and plot the T statistics again for all of these models. As you can see, all of them remain large and highly significant, meaning that there exists a large average effect. It's not driven by some counties or some DMAs with some characteristics that we're not aware of. So let's get to mechanisms. We started pre-existing ideologies. So what about pre-existing ideologies? Effective pre-existing ideologies can go both ways. First, let me explain. First, if the audience shares the same political ideology with Sinclair, therefore they may have more acceptability towards Sinclair messaging, and the effect may be stronger. However, if pre-existing belief is in accord with Sinclair, therefore there may not be much room for additional impact. Therefore, what we say is that the question whether Sinclair will have a larger impact in more liberal or more conservative counties or DMAs will remain an empirical one. So what we do here is we identify a more conservative audience in 3 cross-sections. First, we look at firms that belong to gun, tobacco, and gambling industries. Here is the result. We find that in an interaction term, we find that the results become stronger. Second, we look at firms that are located in DMAs where Sinclair acquired more Fox-affiliated TV stations because obviously the audience is already there. And we find that the effect becomes stronger, but it's interesting. It's only highly significant for the environmental component. And then we look at firms that are in Republican-leaning counties based on their voting patterns in the last presidential election. What we find is that the effect becomes more significant. So overall, we find that our results are consistent with the effect of some ideology effects here. Next, we study other cross-sectional effects here. And we study whether the results are stronger when firms have lower institutional ownership or whether for firms that have prosecution history or firms with younger CEOs. So for lower institutional ownership, we think that it's important because we know more and more institutional owners care about CSR activities of firms and they care about sustainable investment. Therefore, if we have a firm and this firm is really willing to reduce CSR after Sinclair enters, they may not be able to do so if there is a strong presence of institutional owners. Here's the result that we have, and we find that yes, the effect is much stronger for these firms with lower institutional ownership. The second is for firms with a history of prosecutions. We look at corporate prosecution registry. It's a very interesting database. We find that so the idea here is this: firms that have had a history of prosecution may only have invested in CSR activities to mend their reputational damage due to that prosecution. This is consistent with Pat Aki's new paper on corporate hacking. So after Sinclair entry, and if Sinclair covers less of local firms' CSR activities, they may lose incentive way faster than other firms, and we confirm that in this cross-sectional test as well. Finally, there's a literature in psychology that shows older individuals compared to younger ones are more reliant on their own pre-existing knowledge and have more stable belief systems. So as I'm aging, I'm always, I'm getting reminded of that. What we do here is that we hypothesize younger CEOs may therefore adjust corporate policies more in response to changes in media environment and more strongly than older CEOs. We find that this holds. So we're on a list of other robustness checks.
Hosein,
yes.
You're almost out of time. Can you skip the robustness test and go to the conclusion?
Jump to conclusion, of course. Yes, so that was on my last slide. So very good. Thank you so much for your attention. In this paper, we answer an important question: does partisan media influence corporate policies? And we document a positive answer. We also find evidence that both ideology influence and coverage concerns can play a significant role. Thank you so much for your attention. I look forward to Mathilde's discussion and questions from the audience.